A storm suddenly broke over the city of Springfield. In the morning, the sun gently warmed the streets, bathing them in a warm, golden light. However, by evening, the sky had turned dark with thick clouds that smelled of rain. The electric lights along the schoolyard glowed with neon brightness, reflecting off the wet asphalt. Inside the school, the usual hustle and bustle of the 12th grade students filled the air as they awaited the bell to rush out of class and dissolve into their familiar routines. Some were hurrying to extracurricular activities, some to tutoring, while others simply wanted to get home quickly, hide under a blanket, and immerse themselves in their phones. "Please stay for just a minute," rang out the bright voice of the English teacher, Ms. Johnson. The students paused at the doors. Her voice always had a special softness, but at that moment, it carried a firmness she rarely used, which worked without fail. Artem, a tall, lanky boy with unruly chestnut hair, had almost stepped over the threshold of the classroom, but at Miss Johnson's words, he froze and didn't even turn around. "I have an important announcement," she continued, smiling and placing her palm on the desk. "On Friday, we will have a surprise test, so please review the grammar carefully." The class groaned in unison, but no one dared to protest. All the free groups of students poured noisily out of the classroom, except for Artem. "Artem, can you stay behind?" Ms. Johnson asked, looking at him. A shadow of an unclear emotion flickered in her eyes. The boy, even though something inside him tightened with anxious foreboding when the last student left and the door slammed shut, remained standing by his desk. Not knowing whether to sit down or wait, he suddenly felt her asking, "Do you understand why I kept you?" Her long dark hair, softly cascading over her shoulders, added something intimate to the atmosphere. Artem shrugged. She smiled gently, but there was something else in her gaze. She stepped closer, leaning against the edge of his desk and leaning forward so that their eyes met. "You are very capable," she began, but hesitated as if unsure whether to continue. "But..." Artem lazily finished for her with a crooked smirk. She smiled back, but it wasn't her usual smile. "I wanted to offer you extra lessons," she said, shrugging. "It's not tutoring, it's more like help. You want to apply to college, don't you?" Of course, Artem wanted to. It was high time he seriously considered his future, but he couldn't seem to get himself together. "Then we'll meet after school," Miss Johnson concluded. "I think it will be better for you." The boy, uncertainly nodding, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "We'll start tomorrow," she said with a light smile, walking around the desk and turning back to her own. "Now you can go." Artem quickly grabbed his backpack and headed for the exit. As he grasped the doorknob, he heard her voice. "Artem." He turned around again. "I hope you won't let me down." Something in her tone made him nervous, and he swallowed hard. He stepped out into the empty corridor where thunder rumbled outside, slicing through the sky again. The school after hours felt entirely different, without the crowd of students, without bells, voices in the halls, or the rustling of notebooks and philosophical discussions. It resembled an old building holding countless secrets. Artem stood by the window of the English classroom, watching raindrops trickle down the glass, wondering why he even needed these extra lessons. Behind him, Ms. Johnson closed her planner, stacking it neatly. She wore a light dress that accentuated her figure, making Artem feel a little uneasy. "Let's begin," her voice rang out. Artem, despite everything, turned around. "Okay," he said, sitting at the desk and stretching his legs forward. "All right, let's first check your level," she suggested, sitting across from him. She handed him a sheet with exercises, and their fingers accidentally brushed for a moment. Artem didn't know if it was just his imagination, but suddenly it felt hot, and he quickly looked away, burying his gaze in the assignment. It consisted of filling in the blanks and correcting mistakes. "You really aren't as bad as you seem," she said with a slight smirk, quickly marking the errors with a red pen. "I just don't like to struggle," he shrugged. "That's a pity, Artem. You're smart, but you act as if you don't care," she said, raising her gaze. Their eyes met, and there was something different in that gaze that shouldn't have been there. That moment stretched on, and Artem was the first to look away, clearing his throat and trying to speak. Let's get back to the assignments. Let's try a simple conversation in English, she suggested. Artem grimaced. I don't like speaking in English. We'll practice, she smiled, but not in her usual way. There was something dangerous in her smile, and he didn't know how to respond. They began with seemingly simple questions about hobbies, future plans, and favorite movies. The conversation gradually became easier, but it became simpler each time. Ms. Johnson leaned slightly forward. Her fingers lingered near Artem's lips, and he felt a rush of excitement. Are you nervous? She suddenly asked. He blinked, as if waking up. She repeated, Are you anxious? No, he hurriedly replied, turning away. Really? She continued, and he felt her gaze piercing through him. You're acting strange, she noticed, slowly tapping her fingers on the desk. Everything okay? Yeah, he muttered, rubbing his neck. Good. Her voice became slightly quieter, and she smiled. Goosebumps ran down Artem's skin. The conversation continued, but he could no longer concentrate. An hour and a half passed before Ms. Johnson glanced at the clock. I think that's enough for today, she said. Artem stood up so quickly that he nearly knocked over his chair. She laughed. You're always so nervous when you're with me, she observed. Artem swallowed, unsure of what to say. See you tomorrow, she smiled, and he almost bolted out of the classroom. But as he stepped into the dark corridor, he realized that something strange was tightening in his chest. Something inside him whispered that this was dangerous, and he didn't know if he could stop it. Artem couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling as moments from the day replayed in his mind. How she looked at him, how she spoke, how she smiled. There was something in her voice and gaze that captivated him, drawing him in like a magnet. Why did she ask that, he thought. It seemed he knew he shouldn't dwell on it, but inside, he felt that something had changed. The next day at school, he felt strange. It was hard to focus in regular classes, and thoughts of his upcoming lesson with Ms. Johnson swirled in his mind. When the bell rang for the last class, Artem hesitated before leaving the room. Hey, what's up? His friend Nick asked, slapping him on the shoulder. Aren't you going to basketball practice today? Just tired, Artem mumbled. Nick left, and Artem slowly made his way to the English classroom. The door was slightly ajar. He knocked and peeked inside. Ms. Johnson was sitting at her desk, reviewing notebooks. She wore a dark blue dress that accentuated her figure. She looked up and smiled. Yes, Artem, she said. He stepped in and closed the door behind him. At that moment, he felt uneasy. It seemed they were alone together again, and that made him nervous. Shall we begin? Her voice was soft. He turned and settled into the first lesson. It went as usual. They reviewed grammar, read texts, and discussed pronunciation. But with each passing minute, it became increasingly difficult for Artem to focus. She was too close, her voice too soft, and her gaze too intense. You're fidgeting again, she suddenly said, smiling slightly. No. He quickly lowered his eyes to the textbook. Artem, her voice dropped. He looked up. She was gazing at him thoughtfully. Is something wrong? He asked. Ms. Johnson didn't respond right away, contemplating something, and then unexpectedly leaned forward slowly. You've changed, she said quietly. In what way? Artem froze. You look at me differently. He didn't know what to say. The room became too quiet, and he felt he could hear his heart pounding. Maybe you're just tired, she finally said, looking away and smiling as if nothing had happened. Yeah, maybe, he replied. She glanced at the clock. I think that's enough for today. Artem quickly stood up, wanting to leave as soon as possible, but when he reached the door, her voice stopped him. Artem. He turned around. She was looking at him with a smile. Same time tomorrow. Something in her gaze made his heart race again. He felt a dangerous spark igniting inside him. Months passed since Artem had started meeting with Ms. Johnson after school. Their sessions had become something more than just lessons. At first, there were tense, shy glances, unspoken words, accidental touches, and long pauses between sentences, feelings that were impossible to ignore. But sooner or later, reality had to set in. One evening, when they were alone in the classroom again, The silence became too heavy. "You know this can't go on," she said quietly, crossing her arms over her chest. "Why?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Because it's wrong." He smirked, lowering his gaze. "Don't stop this. I thought I could control the situation. And you think everything is just going to work out now?" Her voice became more resolute. "It all has to end." She looked at him for a long time, then unexpectedly reached out and touched his cheek. It was the last touch, the last goodbye. "Yes," she breathed. Artem closed his eyes, feeling something inside break, but he knew she was entitled to her decision. The next day, there were no more lessons. Miss Johnson no longer stayed after school, and they didn't talk anymore. And although everything had ended, Artem knew he would never forget her.